About 15 years ago, I had been really ill throughout the night and kept drifting in and out of sleep. I was only 9 at the time, and I was sleeping in my parents' bed with them so they could keep an eye on me. They had a digital clock that projected the time onto the ceiling, and I remember staring at the numbers and thinking they looked like they were moving. That was about 3:15 a.m. I must have drifted back into sleep soon after. Next thing I knew, I was being jolted awake by our doorbell loudly ringing 3 times, and there were 3 massive thumps on the door that followed it. It was still completely dark in the room, and the numbers on ceiling now said it was exactly 5 a.m. I remember feeling unsure of whether I'd actually heard the noises or just had a vivid dream. But both my parents quickly sat up, asking, "Was that the door?" And I immediately felt terrified. There wasn't anybody who should have been ringing and knocking on our door at that hour of the morning, and so my gut told me it was something bad. I had heard stories around that time of burglars whose method was to knock the door/ring the doorbell and then just barge their way into the house when the homeowner answered. So I was immediately convinced that was what was going to happen. I had a massive fear of burglars, and I felt like I'd entered my worst nightmare. I was even more terrified when my dad got up and went down to the door. There was still banging and ringing, constant at this point. I remember it sounding so urgent and scary, and the sound echoed in the hallway. My dad didn't open the door, thankfully, but he shouted loudly, "Who is it?" And he had no response. He kept repeating himself, but never got an answer. The person just kept ringing and banging on the door. There wasn't a peephole and only a tiny window that was frosted glass, and because it was dark outside, there was no way of seeing who it was. I remember myself and my 2 brothers looking through all of the upstairs windows, but you couldn't see our doorstep from them. It felt like ages passed of my dad shouting and this person ringing, but it must have only been a minute. He quickly called 999, and they dispatched policemen out to our house pretty quickly. By the time I heard the cars outside, the banging and ringing had stopped. I looked out the window and remember feeling so surprised and confused. I'd expected 1 police car, but there were 4 cars and 2 fire engines, which confused me because we hadn't called for fire engines. I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I just remember hearing my dad talking to a policeman. Weirdly enough, I specifically remember, despite my fear and everything going on, thinking, "Oh no, the police are going to see my dad in his pajamas." So my dad shut the door and the fire engines drove away, and only 1 police car stayed a bit longer. My dad came upstairs and gathered us all together to reassure us. Basically what had happened was that the old lady who lived alone next door to us woke up and was convinced she could smell smoke. She was quite a heavy smoker and always smoked indoors, so it was unsurprising that the smell would linger in her house. But she panicked and ran out of her house and tried to wake us up for help. Out of her sheer panic, she just rang and banged constantly, and that along with the fact that she was hard of hearing meant that she couldn't hear my dad shouting, "Who is it?" She also called the police, which was why there were so many cars, and she called the fire service as well. They did a general check before leaving. No fire, and they said it probably was just the lingering cigarette smoke that she had smelled upon waking up. I felt so much relief when my dad told me that, because I had been completely convinced that my worst fears were coming true and somebody was breaking into our house. I felt bad for our neighbor because I know she must have just panicked, but man, she scared the shit out of us. She moved away not long after that. I still think of her from time to time.
As a child, I was pretty dedicated to my fitness routine. My daily regimen included long walks around my neighborhood, which I used as my primary form of cardio. I would walk for hours each day, enjoying the physical activity and the freedom it gave me. It was during these walks that I first encountered the old woman. It started innocuously enough. During one of my walks, I noticed her sitting in a folding chair by the edge of her yard. She was an ancient figure, hunched over with wisps of silver hair escaping from beneath a tattered sun hat. At first, I dismissed her as another curious neighbor, perhaps admiring my youthful dedication to fitness. I often wore tight clothes that showcased my well-toned muscles, the result of my rigorous exercise routine. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see her more frequently. She was always in her folding chair, always watching me. Each time, she seemed a little closer to the path where I walked, her intense stares following my every move. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me. It was as if her eyes were boring into my very soul, silently following me from her chair. One day, things took a stranger turn. As I walked past her, I heard faint whispers. The sound was almost inaudible, carried on the breeze, but it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the tone was unsettling, filled with a sinister edge. This continued for a while, adding a mysterious and eerie element to my daily walks. Eventually, her whispers became clear enough for me to understand. She was trying to tell me to get closer to her. Each day, her chair would be positioned a little nearer to my path until, one day, it was directly in my way. I could see the unnerving look in her eyes and hear her words distinctly. "Come closer," she said in a raspy voice, "I have something to show you." Being a naive kid, I foolishly asked, "What is it?" She responded with the creepiest giggle, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "My collection, dear," she said, pausing to let the words sink in. Her intense stare set an even deeper unease within me. "Come closer, dear," she repeated, her voice dripping with malice. The idea of getting closer to her terrified me. I felt an overwhelming fear that she might grab me and do something terrible. Panicked, I knew I had to find a way to escape her grasp. I started taking different routes and varying my walking times to avoid her. Despite my efforts, the fear of encountering her again haunted me. The thought of her grabbing me and what might happen next was too much to bear. I never told anyone about these encounters, but they haunted my memories. I moved out of that neighborhood long ago, hoping to leave the strange, creepy experiences behind. Even now, the memory of that old woman, her intense stares, and the eerie whispers still linger in my mind, leaving me with a sense of unease and wonder about what it all meant. Years later, I stumbled upon a news report that sent a shiver down my spine. The old woman had been caught and arrested. She had kidnapped a young boy from the neighborhood, and authorities believed she had planned to kidnap others. Her collection, as she had called it, was a room filled with disturbing mementos from her victims, locks of hair, pieces of clothing, even drawings they had made. I realized then how lucky I had been to escape her grasp. The thought that I could have been one of her victims still sends chills through me. I was the lucky one who got away. In the years since, I've often wondered what drove her to such madness. What was it that made her fixate on me, and what horrors did she have in store for her victims? The answers to those questions remain elusive, buried in the shadows of my past. All I know is that I narrowly escaped a fate far worse than I could have ever imagined.
New York, 2023. The city that never sleeps, but here, in this quiet neighborhood on the outskirts, it felt as though time itself had dozed off, wrapped in a heavy shroud of silence. My husband, David, and I moved here last spring, drawn by the promise of peace and a fresh start. What we got was something entirely different. From the moment we arrived, there was a sense of unease that hung heavy in the air, like a fog that never lifted. The locals were polite but distant, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. And there were whispers, soft, insidious rumors of an unknown presence that lurked in the shadows. I dismissed them at first, attributing them to small-town superstition. But as the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere only grew darker, more oppressive. David, on the other hand, seemed to thrive here. He quickly became enamored with the neighborhood, making friends with our strange neighbors and immersing himself in the community. He brushed off the odd occurrences, the flickering lights, the strange noises at night, the way our cat, Midnight, refused to go near the basement as mere quirks of an old house. Despite my growing unease, he seemed happier than ever. It all came to a head one rainy evening in October. The power had gone out, plunging our home into darkness. I was fumbling for a flashlight when I heard it, a soft, whispering voice coming from the basement. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly descended the creaky wooden stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. There, in the corner of the basement, stood David. His back was to me, but I could see he was speaking to someone, or something, that wasn't there. "David?" I called out, my voice trembling. He turned slowly, his eyes wide and vacant. "They're here, Emily," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "They've always been here." It was then that I noticed the symbols etched into the basement walls, strange and unsettling. They glowed faintly, pulsing with a sickly green light. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed David's arm, pulling him upstairs. "We need to leave," I insisted, but he just shook his head, a serene smile on his face. As we delved deeper into the history of the neighborhood, we uncovered the chilling truth. The place was cursed, bound by some ancient, malevolent force. Once you moved in, it was nearly impossible to leave. It was like a cult, a web of dark influence that ensnared its victims, binding them to the land. The more I learned, the more desperate I became. I tried everything, calling realtors, looking for rental properties, even trying to book a hotel room, but there was always some obstacle, some reason we couldn't leave. It was as if the neighborhood itself was conspiring to keep us there. David's behavior grew more erratic. He would disappear for hours, only to return with vague explanations and that same unsettling smile. Our once happy marriage was unraveling, strained by the mounting fear and paranoia. I felt like I was losing him to the darkness that lurked within the neighborhood. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were coming from just outside our window. I peered through the curtains and saw our neighbors gathered in the street, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight. They were chanting softly, their voices blending into an eerie, hypnotic melody. I knew then that I had to act. I couldn't let the neighborhood consume us. Gathering my courage, I confronted David. "We need to leave, now," I said firmly. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and resignation. "You don't understand, Emily," he replied. "We can't leave. We belong here." Determined to escape, I began to make plans in secret. I packed a bag with essentials, hid it in the closet, and waited for the right moment. But the neighborhood seemed to sense my intentions. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt eyes watching me wherever I went. The final straw came when I found Midnight dead in the basement, her small body twisted in a way that defied explanation. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter than ever, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. In the dead of night, while David slept, I grabbed my bag and slipped out of the house. I ran through the darkened streets, the whispers chasing me, urging me to turn back. But I kept going, driven by sheer will and the desperate need to escape. As I reached the edge of the neighborhood, I felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure, as if an invisible hand was trying to pull me back. I fought against it, pushing forward until I stumbled out onto the main road. The pressure lifted, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I looked back one last time and saw David standing at the edge of the neighborhood, watching me with those vacant eyes. "You can't leave, Emily," he called out, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "You'll be back. They always come back." I turned away and kept walking, not daring to look back again. The city was still awake, its lights a beacon of hope in the distance. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had escaped the darkness, for now. But even now, in the safety of the city, I can still hear the whispers in my dreams, calling me back. I know that the neighborhood hasn't forgotten me. It's only a matter of time before it tries to reclaim what it believes is rightfully its own. And I wonder if, when that time comes, I will have the strength to resist.